who is going to speak. We have James Wolfin, who is a B-Lab alum and currently is with Twin Cities Seed Co. We have John Trappe, who is a University of Minnesota Extension educator in horticulture, turf, and urban green space. We have Ben Ziegler from the University of Minnesota B-Lab Research Division. And we have Aaron Iber, who is also an alum of the B-Lab and who is currently with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as an inspector there. And he is going to talk about some recent publications that will be exciting for you all to hear. So Slow-Mow Summer, here we are to learn about why we're trying to push this new slogan, which you'll notice is not No-Mow May. So we'll start out with our first speaker, who is James Wolfin.
Hey there, so I'm going to share my slide deck here. And are we all able to see it okay here? Are those slides going through for everyone? Yeah, so I want to start off by giving everyone...
Just so you know, we're seeing it as where you see all the ones on the side. It's not just the full presentation.
Bingo. There we go. Now we should be in the clear, right?
Yes.
Yep, good.
Okay. So I want to start off with a brief introduction, kind of giving a deeper look into No-Mow May. Oh, and before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the university's Turfgrass Science Lab, where John Trappe, who we mentioned before, is repping us there. I'm going to just barely scratch the surface of diving into how this all works from a turfgrass science point of view, but John's going to give a much deeper insight into how we can create more sustainable lawns across the board. So starting with a deeper look into No-Mow May. So I think the kind of core premise here is that No-Mow May has the absolute best intentions. This kind of movement has become so popular because so many folks like yourselves are just incredibly passionate about wanting to do better in your lawn, in your garden, for the conservation of pollinators and the conservation of natural resources. The issue is that this No-Mow May movement across the board truly has limited functionality, where there's just some inherent problems associated with not mowing your lawn through a time of year where your grass grows really, really fast. So what I want to do is I want to start off by taking a step back and looking at what are the basic goals that we're looking to achieve through No-Mow May. And to me, it comes down to two things. We want to reduce mowing and other inputs to lower our carbon footprint within our yard. We want to make a more eco-friendly lawn. And two, we want to provide forage for pollinators when blooms are scarce, where that's definitely a huge one, something that Elaine, Aaron, a lot of the B-Lab folks are going to talk about, where we don't have too many blooms early in the year here in Minnesota, kind of in the April, May time of year. So how can we kind of give a boost there as well? So what is the issue with No-Mow May? So our turf grass doesn't grow at the same rate throughout the year. Our turf grass tends to grow fastest between the temperatures of 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And here in Minnesota, that is very often the temperatures we experience in May. So what we've seen in a lot of these No-Mow May lawns is that lawns will grow up to 3, 6, 12, 18, sometimes 24 inches in height, only to be cut back on June 1st or the first week of June. The issue here is that in turfgrass science, you want to follow the rule of 1/3 when it comes to mowing. You don't want to mow more than 1/3 the total height of the lawn. So going from 18 or 24 inches down to a 3 to 4 inch height can be very stressful to your lawn, sometimes potentially killing that lawn, which result in all sorts of different environmental issues. I know a lot of folks here may be thinking to themselves, what's the big deal if we kill the lawn? But when we kill our lawns, there can be a lot of bare soil exposed, which leads to all sorts of issues when it comes to stormwater runoff, taking contaminants in the soil, bringing it into nearby bodies of water. So how can we better achieve these goals associated with No-Mow May? Let's start first by thinking about reducing inputs. So the key here, and John's going to go into a lot more detail, is to use low input turf. So with low input turf, there's a few big advantages. One, reduced mowing. Rather than picking a month to reduce mowing altogether because of alliteration, if we use low input species, we can cut mowing down to 2 to 4 times per year, simply because these grass species, the fescues, grow much slower than your traditional Kentucky bluegrass. Also, mowing based on height is a big one. Rather than just arbitrarily mowing your lawns once per week or once every 10 days throughout the majority of the summer, If we wait until our lawns get a little bit taller, perhaps out to 6 inches, and cut them down to 4 inches, that'll further reduce the mowing we need to do. Number 2, using less fertilizer. So every time we use a fertilizer, we're putting nitrogen and phosphorus down in our lawns, and that has the potential to leach off into nearby bodies of water. These low input fescues have 1/6 the fertilizer requirement of the traditional Kentucky bluegrass. And finally, saving water. Fine fescues and tall fescues alike have much deeper root systems than Kentucky bluegrasses, meaning that you don't have to water them nearly as frequently. So this is a fantastic picture that I've been shown for years. It's one that a former extension agent from the turfgrass science lab showed me. And all this does is it shows 3 different turfgrass species after 45 days without any access to moisture. The Kentucky bluegrass goes dormant, the tall fescue is nice and green, the fine fescue is nice and green. I can stand up here and talk all I want about these different grasses. I think sometimes a picture can be much more powerful. I always try to stray away from getting too research heavy in talks like this, but this is one table that I cannot refrain from showing. What this table shows is carbon emissions due to lawn maintenance in the US. On the left, you can see low input lawns, and on the right, you have high input lawns. And what they found is that carbon emissions are about 1/3 of the norm in low input lawns as compared to high input lawns. So simply by using a different turfgrass species, you can cut your emissions down to 1/3 of what they currently are. So how can we better achieve these goals from a pollinator forage point of view? We want to provide food for our pollinators when resources are truly scarce. And one way to do that is by reducing our lawn footprint while placing an emphasis on providing blooms to our pollinators when in the spring, when there's not too much out there for them to eat. Elaine and Aaron are going to talk a lot more about that. Also, providing early season pollinator friendly trees and shrubs. I hear so many folks talking about dandelions in the month of May. If you lift that head up like 45 degrees and check out the serviceberry or the crabapple, you will see so many pollinators in there because of the burst of blooms that's going on at this point. And finally, by using some pollinator friendly flowers in our lawns that have been intentionally selected for pollinators to forage on, just combining low input turf with low growing flowers. I'll talk about that myself later on here. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to John, and we're going to bring on this Slow-Mow Summer.
Thanks, James. So I'm going to be just going into just a little bit of background as far as, what kind of motivated some of this, and then talk about it from a turf physiology standpoint. So we've got, there's been just a tremendous amount of interest in No-Mow May lawns. And from an extension standpoint, this has certainly eclipsed the #1 interest issue, which has historically been creeping Charlie, how to control creeping Charlie in my lawn, to now being, what do you think about No-Mow May? And where this originally came from is a paper published in the journal Peer J that basically introduced the concept of, well, not introduced it, but looked at from a research standpoint the effect of abstaining from mowing in May on what that would do to pollinators found in lawns. And this was in September of 2020, a paper published from research from Wisconsin. And as it would turn out, there was just been tremendous amount of interest in looking at No-Mow May. Here you can see an increase in the number of Google searches over the last few years for it. But then eventually, as Zach Portman from the University of Minnesota published a paper on, with just documenting some of the problems, some issues with this initial journal article documenting these effects. As a result, the journal itself has since issued a retraction. So not just saying, hey, there are some issues with this, it's fully retracting the science from or the paper from the journal itself. So with that said, I still think that there's just been so much interest from this movement, and I think it's worth us from an educational standpoint taking advantage of that momentum and talking about it from, regardless of whether or not you are trying to maintain a lawn to benefit pollinators. So I think there's a lot of learning lessons here. So, but first let's talk about how does this affect our lawns? What does this mean for the grass itself? James presented a very similar photo already, and just basically documenting what the turf is actually doing as growing throughout the calendar year. And coincidentally, the month of May is the time in which we have a strong flush of growth right before you'll notice that summer decline. And from a physiology standpoint, we really have two opportunities to maintaining a healthy lawn throughout the year, and those are in the fall, going right into the winter, and then spring going right before the summer months. So we basically have a great time for growing, a stress period, a great time for growing, followed by a stress period, and so on and so forth. So we really, you're really you have to think in terms of what's next, not just what's going on right now. And so if you think about this from as how lawns and how grasses fit into the landscape, if your principal concern is focusing on pollinators, what does this mean for the grasses that may be growing amongst them? Here's a photo that I took in St. Paul back in 2018, and I think this individual was really just mowing around where they saw some wildflowers grow, or some flowers growing in their boulevard. And and I think from a pollinator standpoint, sure, this is great, but what does this mean for the grass itself? Well, presumably, this was done in one or two cuttings, but you don't really notice a whole lot of clippings here, despite there being a lot of biomass around the other flowers. And so, you have to think, okay, well, where did the clippings go? Because as I've received questions from lawn care companies this spring or this winter, there's a lot of this growth, what should we be doing with the clippings after this is actually happening? And what ends up happening really is that because there's such an excessive amount of growth, the clippings themselves need to be removed from the site in order to be composted offsite. And so in doing so, you're essentially removing nitrogen from the lawn. The lawn clippings themselves contain about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet a year. For most lawns, regardless of the species, that could be as much as 50% of the nitrogen that a lawn would use in a year, up to or down to a third or a fourth of the amount of nitrogen. So it's it's a significant amount of nitrogen that would be removed if we need to compost clippings offsite and we can't recycle them there. So here's a photo I took back in 2019 in Washington, D.C. at our nation's capital. And I think this was just because it was a really wet spring. I don't think it was deliberately because of No-Mow May, for example. But we've got early June. We've got a lot of growth here. And if you see a lot of the seed heads from the plants, that's very costly from a turf plant perspective to produce those seed heads for them to be removed. So if you have an example like this where you're first getting out and you're first mowing in early June, what's going to happen if you have something that we noticed or that we observed in early June of 2021, where we had the hottest June on record, where we had 9 days in a row of 90+ degree temperature. So you're essentially allowing the plant to spend a lot of energy producing seed heads or a lot of growth, and then you are potentially removing that and stressing that plant out. And that wasn't unique to just a 21. In 2022, we also had one of the hottest days on record, at least in June as well. So this could potentially be a trend, but it really just depends on the year on what that actually is going to mean for the lawn itself and how much growth you could expect. But regardless of that, I still think, as a traditional turf scientist, I think that there's still a lot of lessons to be made from this. And I think that there's a lot of great teaching moments. So in the spirit of No-Mow May, I think we can still promote healthier lawns by doing something that we have been recommending from a turf management perspective for pretty much forever. And that's really just to raise the mowing height to promote a healthier lawn. You can, in doing so, you can protect flowering plants and the pollinators themselves. So, and where that comes from is this 1/3 rule. And what we're proposing to do is mow based on when the lawn itself needs it, not what day of the week it is or what month it is. So, and the 1/3 rule basically states never mow more than 1/3 of the plant's leaf surface on any single mowing. If you do that, what you end up getting is you get the scalping effect, where you're removing the plant's ability to make and create energy, the plant's ability to cool itself down. So it's really, you're trying to prevent this from happening. Mowing itself is already a stressful event for really any plant, even grasses that are adapted for grazing. So, but if we can try to reduce that by mowing at a higher height of cut, what we can actually get is we can actually increase the amount of time between our mowing events. And that has to do with mowing based off the 1/3 principle. So as you increase your mowing height up to 4 inches, for example, as you increase mowing height, you increase the interval or the time between mowing events. So you have to mow less frequently, and reducing the amount of carbon emissions that James had mentioned earlier. And, just the amount of stress that you're putting on your lawn. The added benefit of raising the mowing height is that you're increasing the rooting depth. So if you think in terms of, a tree, for example, if you think about the roots are oftentimes portrayed as being, as much as what you see above ground is what you see below ground. You can think the same thing about grasses. And so as we raise the mowing height, we can, in doing so, we can increase the amount of rooting depth, allowing the plants themselves to be able to obtain more soil moisture. So higher mowing height equals fewer mowing events, more potential for flowers themselves. We have healthier, more resistant turf because the turf itself is more drought tolerant. And then it provides fewer opportunities for pests, things like crabgrass or Japanese beetle white grub species, for example. And then, as to play off this is actually something that we've been recommending for the last couple of years, is looking at alternative lawn types, such as this No-Mow fine fescue lawn here in St. Paul, where, this is a lawn that's really only clipped a couple of times a year. And it's really, from this standpoint, it's really trying to, not necessarily for the promotion of pollinators, but it's really just as a traditional lawn sense, but still being able to have a minimal impact from mowing. So there's, this is something that we've been promoting for several years, and we have lots of ongoing research projects looking at this as an alternative to the traditional lawn type. So as practical ways of reducing the amount of mowing events that that are needed, we recommend plant improved lower input cultivars or species like fine fescues, turf type tall fescues, mow according to the 1/3 rule. So mow as needed, use a higher mowing height whenever possible. For most walk behind mowers or even riding lawnmower types, this is literally the highest mower setting. So you get to mow less frequently and promote a healthier lawn, and in doing so, benefit the pollinators as much as possible. And if you are going to be mowing, recycle or mulch the clippings whenever possible. So if after hearing all of this, if you're still thinking about taking part in No-Mow May or abstaining from mowing in May, at the very least, I recommend mow at the tallest setting possible for that first mowing or whenever you choose to mow. Try to remove the clumps of clippings to compost offsite, because clumps of those clippings are going to shade out or smother any other plants that you have, even the pollinating species. So, consider that as well. Gradually lower the mowing height over 2 to 3 mowing events. So allowing the lawn to try to recover between mowings, so that way you're not going from a foot down to 3 inches, for example. Take it down in sequential steps. Try to mow on dry, unstressed turf whenever possible. And if at all possible, consider mowing in the evenings. I'm not sure if there's really any data to support this as far as a time of the day mowing, but at least in terms of applying pesticides from a recommendation standpoint to have a minimal impact on pollinators, the recommendation is to try to do that when those pollinators are not active, and that would be closer to the evening hours. And so if we can mow, then we're providing less of a physical disruption there. So my take-home points are really, No-Mow May could result in a stress lawn depending on the weather. And I think, it's obviously up to the individual on whether or not they want to take part in that. But our recommendation is to really focus on sound management practices. And you can still try to do the most as far as promoting pollinators or having as minimal disturbance on them. Planting low input lawns like fine fescue are going to require less mowing. They're also going to be, more of a suitable habitat for pollinating species and the pollinators themselves. And mow when the lawn needs it, not what day or month it is. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to the group, and thank you all very much.
I'm going to jump in now. We've been looking at our feet for the most part so far. I'm hoping that we can take a look farther up. There's a lot of vertical room we could put in our yards to help pollinators. So we'll look at shrubs and trees that we can implement for blooms for the most part beginning of the year. But I'm going to show you some items that'll go all the way through the end of the year. Next, please. Pollinators need food. Next, they need, in terms of food, we got pollen, nectar, and leaf tissues. I'll show you different variants of each of those throughout, but we're trying to pay attention to multiple aspects of providing food for pollinators, and in doing so, you got to pay attention to phenology. Phenology is what plant event is happening when throughout the year. Next, please. So starting with our early bloomers, this is a box elder here. Lots of maples. Box elder is a maple. I don't know if everyone knows that, but a lot of our maples are some of the first to open up throughout the year. Next, hop hornbeams, eastern redbuds. You can keep clicking through. Sycamores, cottonwoods, pussy willows, among other willows, forsythias, oaks, and speckled alders. Those are all very early season blooms that a lot of pollinators rely on after they're coming out of a tough winter where they've had to either hibernate, go into a torpor status, or just bear with the cold throughout the season. So they'll need that bloom or that pollen and nectar to get up their energy stores and start repopulating their colonies. Next. Fruits. This is my favorite. Pretty much any fruit that you see on a bush or tree that we like to eat, a pollinator likes to get at that as well. So anything that you find delicious, put it in your yard. I was having a hard time coming up with something that wasn't on a bush that a pollinator couldn't use. So stone fruits, those are pears, plums, some peaches, hawthorns, service berries. Amelanchier is another name, service berries. When I say berries, I'm talking blueberries, honeyberries, currants, gooseberries, aronia berries, apples, and pears. All of those are fantastic early season blooms for pollinators. Next. Summer. I know we're talking about May, but you got to think about the whole rest of the year as well. Summer is a big time, especially for honeybees. They make a lot of their honey at that point. The early blooms that we're talking, honey locust, viburnums, or nannyberries, American mountain ash, elderberries, butternuts, tulip trees, and sumacs. Those are all pretty good pollen and nectar sources. Now, when I say prime time here, basswood and northern catalpa, those are really good honey producers. I come from viewing this as a honeybee view, so this is kind of important on our end here. This basswood and catalpa in the middle of the summer, and then at the end of summer, you've got roses and dogwoods. Those are good in drought times. They will still produce nectar and pollen during the end of the year, especially the last 2 years that we've had. I've seen a fair number of honeybees and other pollinators on roses and dogwoods during those dry points. A lot of the time, shrubs and trees will do fairly better compared to more herbaceous plants in terms of food production for pollinators during those droughty times. So this is another positive aspect for woody or something to put in your yard. Next, please. On the left-hand side, we got catalpa. On the right-hand side, there was some sumac. Late bloomers, this is another something to think about. There's not a whole, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've only got 2 items on this page. In terms of woody items, there's not a whole lot of plants that grow in Minnesota that are reliably producing late in the year. But witch hazel is one they'll bloom all the way into November sometimes. And then white meadowsweet is another one. I kind of hesitated putting this on the list because it's on the verge of being a shrub, but I needed to give you something late in the year rather than just witch hazel. Next, please. Tissue. This is another one that a lot of people don't think about. There are a lot of pollinators, especially when they're caterpillars. They need to eat leaves. We've been talking about blooms a lot so far, but there's tissues as well. Prickly ashes. You can keep clicking through here. Prickly ashes, oaks, hackberries, and hop hornbeams. These are all good plants to provide caterpillars and a few others tissues to grow and then later pupate on, turn into their adult form. So if you do see caterpillars on some of your trees, identify what it is first before you just say that it's just chewing up the leaves of it. You may be taking out a pollinator for something that you may rely on in different form later. So ID what is eating your plants before you say it's a pest. Next. Nesting. This is another thing that I don't think gets enough view. If you had, this is a tree, a basswood that had died on campus, and we had said maybe we keep it there to provide homes for overwintering homes for a number of different pollinators. They'll bore into trees. They'll find little nooks and crannies underneath the bark, or even down in the root system. So a problem tree, maybe you don't necessarily take it out. Next picture, please. This is an example of, it was a problem tree, but they've limbed up the top of it, put a couple burrow holes into it with a chainsaw, and now it is a pollinator tree. So if you have a space that is not necessarily right underneath a walkway, but if you have a wooded area like you see in the image here, maybe you keep a standing snag like that in order to provide overwintering sites. Next, please. Natural cavities. If you have an arborist come out and find that your tree is relatively solid, they don't see and there's any structural issues with the tree, no reason to cut it right down. This is an image of an oak, the pin oak that I've got in my backyard, and there's little holes all the way up and down the trunk, which I have decided the tree's in pretty good shape. It's not really in a place that it's in danger of coming down on anything. I'm going to keep it there the way it is, and whoever wants to move in can move in. Next, please. And if your tree doesn't make it, again, we had an earlier picture. These were some river birches, I think, that didn't make it outside of our lab, but we decided to keep these about 3-4 feet high. And again, we'll have some burrowing, chewing beetle, or not beetle, but bee rather, that'll chew into the stem or find its way underneath the little flaky bits of bark to overwinter. So another something to think about if you have wood on the property that is not faring so well. Next, please. And this is going into it even more. This image here is a silver maple from afar. It looks like a silver maple, but remember when you were a kid, next image, and you went up close to it and you were peeling back the bark on it. This is a close-up. All that peely bark of the silver maple or a shagbark hickory is another great example. Lots of things will overwinter underneath that bark. You would be surprised that if you were to peel off all those strips of bark, how many little larval or pupating animals are hidden underneath there. So that's another plan. If you're thinking of, I want to plant something in the yard, or I want to keep something in the yard, this nesting aspect, really important thing that I don't think gets enough thought, especially in terms of comparing it to blooms. Next, please. This is a big list of understory shrubs. There's overall less maintenance that needs to get done with understory shrubs compared to your lawn, for example, or a tree. If you can handle that look, some people can, some people can't. And overall, there's more square footage for nesting sites than your lawn, for example. There's only so many places that somebody can find an overwintering site or a nesting site in your lawn, as opposed to how many little leaves I can crawl under, how many stems I can burrow into there. So this is a big list of understory plants that are pretty good producers of nectar and pollen, along with some good sites for tissue consumption as well. Next. Go back one if you would. So in this image right here, I'm just walking along the street to get to my car, and in this image I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 understory shrubs that are pretty good for pollinators. I see gooseberry, I see some woodbine, I see the stems of elderberry, and what is that one there? Box elder. Those are, you can pack a lot into a little tiny space. This is maybe only 10 feet of space, and I see 4 or 5 different pollinator understory shrubs that fit right into that spot. So when I'm talking about fitting a lot into a little space, understory shrubs can really fill the bill. Next. Disease prevention. This is another thing that I don't know if many people besides a beekeeper ever considers, but there are resins that plants produce, and when it's brought into especially a honeybee hive, we're calling this propolis. That's kind of the bees' medicine cabinet. They're living inside of their medicine cabinet then once they move propolis into their nest. In Minnesota, it's been confirmed that cottonwood and balsam poplar provide propolis, and it is probable that spruces, pines, birches, alders, beeches, and buckeyes all produce resins for bees to come take into their burrows and use as a kind of a living medicine cabinet. Next. Here's some more images of alders and buckeyes. Anything with a kind of if you see a bud, a terminal bud at the end of a branch that is real glistening, kind of shiny, those are probably good bets that a bee or another pollinator is going to use that for their living medicine cabinet. Next, please. This is the be careful list. There's a number of pollinator plants that are good pollinator plants, but they are not necessarily good for the rest of our environment or farmers or woods. A lot of these can get out of control. So if you have some of these, some of them need to be removed according to the DNR noxious weed list. Some of them you need to be careful about spreading. Maybe they can stay where they're at, but some of them do need to get removed. So on this be careful list, and you can keep clicking through here, I've got alternates for each of these that provide either similar shape or a different or a similar color. If you're looking for your color palette in your yard, go ahead, keep clicking through. The Japanese barberry, you got currants, winterberry hollies. The forsythia's got similar flowers, the pea shrub, the serviceberry, same fall color as an amber maple, Norway maple and sugar maple. At a glance, I have a hard time telling the two apart from a distance. Winged euonymus and aronia, they both have good fall foliage color. Honeysuckles, there's just as many native good ones as there is non-native and invasive bad ones. And then your black locust is a fantastic honey plant, but it spreads too easily. It's got all sorts of big thorns on it. There's a lot of reasons people don't like it. Do a Kentucky coffee tree instead. So keep in mind what you should or shouldn't have in your yard. You can look at the DNR list and then consider an alternative if you see something that you're not particularly fond of. Do a little bit of research and see what'll fill that bill. Next. And here's just a couple resources for you to look up. If you're wanting, if you saw anything off of this little quick presentation that looked interesting to you, particularly the U.S. Forest Service Fire Effect Information System, that is a fantastic site. It gives you a lot of information as to what exactly this plant needs. Does it need sandy soil? Does it need this pH? Is it good and wet? Is it good and dry? That's a fantastic site for picking up the ins and outs of, is my plant a good fit for my yard? All right, that's about all I got for you. If you got questions, I'll hang out afterwards.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Elaine Evans. I'm going to be talking about some early spring resources for bees. You can go to the next slide. So we'll see. Oh, those things aren't working. I have some videos there. Maybe one of them will work. But the idea here is just like Ben was talking about, the bees are in early spring, they're coming out from hibernation. So I just have a couple videos of bees going into or coming out of holes. So all of the bees that we have are overwintering and coming out sometime in the spring or early summer, having not eaten since the previous fall. So they need food when they're coming out. You can go to the next slide. In looking at who is coming out when, we have over 500 different species of bees in Minnesota. And then if we expand out to thinking about other pollinators like the flies and butterflies and wasps, all kinds of different things, those numbers get even bigger. But I think some of the reason why people have talked about May is that's when we really start seeing more bees in the landscape. So this graph here I'm showing you, this is just from iNaturalist, which is a public biodiversity portal. So this is a place where all kinds of people are just taking pictures of any kind of living thing and sharing them on this web platform or their app. And this is just pulling out all of the bee observations that are in Minnesota. I actually took out honeybees because they cheat a little bit where they don't really go into, you can see them kind of any warm day throughout the winter. Anytime it gets warm, they're just kind of staying inside their colony all year. So I took them out of here because it's not fair if you see them in if there's a 50, anytime the weather gets warm, they'll start showing up. So this is looking at all of the other bees. So they're starting to come out pretty early. There's some species that are coming out as early as kind of mid-March. Others are coming out through April. You can see in May, that's when we start to really see a lot of bees. And so this is just numbers that people are seeing. It's not necessarily, documenting that they're first emerging from hibernation, but as more of them come out, more people are seeing them. An important thing to note here is that, I'm just doing this through the end of May, but there are bees that keep coming out. Some bees, a lot of our solitary bees, they're only out as adults for maybe 3 weeks every year, and those weeks are staggered kind of throughout the season. So there are some bees that remain hibernating until July, and they're not coming out as adults until July. So a lot of the questions I get from people about, how do I, a lot of the idea with No-Mow May is protecting those hibernating bees. It's like, well, when is it safe to remove the habitat? Well, there's some bees that need that protection through till July, that they need that habitat there. And then by the time you get to July, there's other bees that are already hibernating again because they were just out for a few weeks in April. So there's there's pretty much always going to be bees needing habitat somewhere, sometime throughout the year. You can go to the next slide. But you can see there really are a lot of bees that are coming out in this kind of early springtime, and there are lots of different ways to support them. So one of them is the flowers that are in the lawns. But in looking at kind of where most bees are and what kind of flowers they're using, So here's a couple important shrubs, trees and shrubs. So willows and maples are really important for a lot of those early pollinators, as well as woodland flowers. So looking at what's happening in April, most of those bees that we see at that time and looking at the diversity of bees that are out there, a lot of those are on willows, maples, and these diversity of woodland flowers. So I talked about these solitary bees that are out just for a couple weeks over the year, and so for these bees that only emerge out in April, they really need flowers then. But even for some of our social bees, bees that build up colonies through the year, so a bee like a bumblebee will start just from a queen that comes out, she overwintered by herself, she starts up a nest. These early spring resources, so they're emerging from hibernation in April and May, those early resources that the queen has access to, there's been some research showing that those are some of the most, that's really the most important time of the year for determining how their colony is going to succeed later. So basically, if they don't have enough resources to start in this early springtime, they're less likely to be able to grow and get to the point where they can produce new queens to start colonies the next year. You can go on to the next slide. Looking at these top bee flowers for May. Oh, it looks like my name got lost on the first one, but that is penstemon. There are a lot of different species of penstemon. Virginia waterleaf is another plant that we see a lot of bees on. Later in May, kind of bleeding over into June, golden alexander and wild geranium are really important. And so I'm just picking out a few of the ones that are kind of my favorites, or one that I've seen from looking at bees and looking at the data, looking at observations. Where do we see the most bees? Where do we see the most kinds of bees in these time periods? Those are some of the ones that come to the top for me. You can go to the next slide. But when we're looking at, how do we create both sustainable and sustaining habitat? So, mowing less frequently, allowing there to be blooms on the lawn, that's definitely a good piece of that. But also considering native plants as much as possible. They just simply are able to sustain more wildlife. When you're looking at what things you're going to plant in your landscape, thinking about what's going to be able to survive in our future climate. So especially looking at this kind of early time of year when with differences in climate, more kind of weird weather events, we can have later frost, we can have hotter springs. Having plants that are tolerant, either drought tolerant or flood tolerant, frost tolerant, that can deal with these kind of wavering weather patterns to be able to still provide something there. I'm a big fan of messy corners in yards. So, I was talking about there's never really a time when the bees are done using habitat because there's always a different bee species that's out and needs it then. Having corners that you can just leave completely alone can be really important for bees and other pollinators, other wildlife, just to have some spaces that you can kind of let be as wild as you can. And just keeping in mind that bees and a lot of other creatures need that habitat year round. So by thinking about what's happening in May, we can help to get things on the right track for the start of the year, but we really need to even be looking at what's happening in April, what's happening in July, what's happening in September, what's happening through the winter, to make sure that there's a whole thread of support for bees and other pollinators. And I think that's it for me.
Am I next?
Go ahead, Aaron.
All right, let's do it. Okay, gotta figure out how to share my screen here. Okay. All right, can everybody see this?
Yes, you are in notes mode, so.
That's, yep, there we go. All right. Okay, how's that look?
Great.
Good. All right. So my name's Aaron. I, like in the introduction, I am an inspector, a state regulator for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I'm not here under that capacity, so I just want to make that clear. If you have any questions about pesticide regulations, you can find my name and phone number on the Minnesota Department of Agriculture website. You can call me tomorrow if you want. But I am here because I, like James, am an alumni out of Dan Carabo's B Lab. Actually, James might have been in Marla's lab, same building. And when I was there, I was working on a project collecting bees in community gardens in Minneapolis. So there are two parts to this project, really briefly. So I won't get into the funding and stuff, but I had undergrads helping me through the UROP program, which is the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. And that's how we obtained some funding for this project. And then we also had other people like from the Urban Scholars Program out of St. Olaf, and then the Step Up Achieve program. So those are our undergrad helpers. They're lovely people to work with, and I think they learned a lot. So I hope so anyway. So there are two components to this project. I'm only going to talk primarily about the community garden aspect of it, but I'll briefly mention the pollinator patches. So they were planted by the city of Minneapolis in 2016. And the idea was to plant these with native plants, native to Minnesota, that are pollinator friendly, in order to promote, pollinator health and wild bees. We did sample from those. I only did it for 1 year because nobody was maintaining them, and I think the city kind of forgot about them, so they kind of fell into disrepair and weeds overtook it, which is still interesting. Weeds are really interesting to pull bees from, but it got kind of messy. So I'm just going to talk about the community gardens today. So we sampled from 6 different community gardens in Minneapolis. And we caught, using hand nets, we caught bees right off of the flowers themselves. And the reason we chose community gardens is because in these urban areas, like in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, urban areas are usually, pretty significant in their impermeable surfaces, so like asphalt, sidewalks, concrete. It makes it hard for bees to find nesting sites. So many native bees in Minnesota are ground nesting and they need open soil. Many of them are cavity nesting. So like Ben was saying, they need those spaces on like dead trees or in dead vegetation, and usually woody, not always, but usually woody vegetation. Cities also have usually more non-native plant species than native. But there have been studies that have been coming out in recent years that suggest that urban areas may be able to sustain similar levels of wild bee diversity in abundance compared to farmlands and nature preserves. So it's very interesting, and we want to know why that is. I think community gardens and other green spaces play a pretty important role in that. So we chose community gardens because they break up these impermeable surfaces. They provide nesting areas and flowers. There's also social benefits to it, like gardening is good for your mental health and your physical health. It's good environmentally because they can filter out toxins and stuff like that. So and I use the definition of a community garden by this paper here, not to get too much into it, but it's a plot of land grown by different families in a common area used to grow food, and it's usually urban dwellers. And it's a bottom up and community based, and they're collaborative efforts to grow food primarily. So our research goals, we wanted to provide a list of host plants, so of flowering plants in community gardens that were visited by wild bees. And then we wanted to provide a species list of all the bees that we collected in these community gardens. Pretty simple. So we had 6 sites, 6 gardens. They varied in size. One was huge. Sabathani actually does not exist anymore. It was paved over, which is very sad. I only found that out recently. So that was our largest one. Hub of Heaven was the smallest one. And we did it in 2017 and 2018. Yeah, there's some stuff in there's information here that might not be super interesting, but we collected almost 3,000 bees over those 2 years, and we started in 2017 at the beginning of June, which is a little late for what I wanted to do. So I was able to do the beginning of 2018, the spring, up until the end of May. So to get a full season of bees. And we collected 98 species of bees from 26 genera and 5 families. And of those 98 species, 7 were non-native and 91 were native. And then we collected bees off of 112 host plant species, so flowering species from 29 families. And like Elaine was saying, there are over 500 species of native bee in Minnesota. So we collected about a fifth of those species. When I was doing this, Zach hadn't been identified. Zach Portman is our taxonomist. He hadn't been identifying every single bee specimen in the universe at that time. So it was only about 420 species when I was doing it. So my numbers were a little more impressive then, but still pretty good. So about a fifth. So the top 5 bee species that we collected, honeybee, they're just everywhere. The common eastern bumblebee, it's very common, hence the name. The eastern cucurbit bee, so those are interesting, and we can talk about those a little more. And the sweat bee, Lasioglossum imitatum, and then the yellow-faced bee, it's a Haleus morpho species. So Haleus are tricky to identify. So here are our non-native bees. So apologies if the text is small, but you can see there are 7, and they all come here from different routes. And most of these are cavity nesting bees. And the idea is that their cavity nesting bees non-native bees tend to be cavity nesting bees because they're easier to transport through like pallets and shipping containers. That's the idea. So pretty interesting. Found 7 non-native bees. And I kind of put in there, so like Wilkie's mining bee is a crop pollinator, yellow-faced bee, European woolcarder bee, those are all cavity nesting. The alfalfa leafcutter bee is also a crop pollinator. And then even more interesting, we have 2 state records from this project. So this is the first time these have been documented officially in Minnesota. So Pseudoanthidium nonum, which is a cavity nesting bee. So P nonum is the picture there. Lasioglossum lionotum is a parasite of another Lasioglossum, so it's a kleptoparasite. So it lives off of another bee species. So, and then we found I think 2 specimens. No, just one rusty patch bumblebee specimen unfortunately from the garden that was paved over, Sabathani, which is really unfortunate. But and then we found 1 Bombus terricola, which is a vulnerable species. It's considered vulnerable. And then 1 Bombus fervidus, so the golden northern bumblebee, which is also vulnerable. So the rusty patch was added to the endangered species list in 2017. So that was pretty exciting. And we did not collect. You can see the pictures there. We took photos of them, and then we could identify based on the photos. So we tried really hard not to. Unless we were sure it was Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, we didn't collect bumblebees, the specimens. We just took pictures of them. And then this might be really interesting for everybody here. So the top 10 plant species, these are the species we collected. I don't remember if it's the most, I think it's the most bee species. Yes, the most bee species off of these. So we have chive, field pumpkin, coriander, spearmint, oregano, dill, so the crops, and the weeds. We caught, 34 species off of Brassica rapa, so field mustard. We collected 30 species off of creeping Charlie or ground ivy. So pretty interesting. Got some really good results. Yeah, I was pretty blown away by the number of species that are, that these crops attract. So this is just nesting habits. So there are a couple other studies that we kind of compared our results to. So Fettridge and Matson, they're New York studies. They also looked at community gardens, and those are they found 110 bee species in 21 gardens, and then 54 bee species in 19 gardens. And then most of our bees were ground nesting. About a quarter of them were cavity nesting. And then about 12% of them were kleptoparasites. So again, those are bees that live off of other bees. So pretty interesting. So garden plants that we found that are important for bee communities. So we collected the rusty patch, there's 2 other bee species, Terricola and bumblebee species, Terricola and Fervidus. We collected off of common garden plants like oregano, pumpkin, bee balm, so Monarda fistulosa, red clover. Now, Bombus affinis, I think it was just field pumpkin, but Fervidus, we collected about 20 species or 20 specimens off of all those different plants. And then, so out of crops, like all those crops, we collected 77 bee species, and wild chive was 45 of those. Collected just so pretty high diversity of bee species going to wild chive. And then, like I said, field mustard was 34 bee species, and total for weeds was 66 bee species. We collected bees off of every plant that was flowering in our sample area, whether it was a weed, ornamental, like an herb, vegetable, native plant, whatever. If it was blooming, we counted it and we collected bees off of it. So yeah, just in conclusion, the crop species attracted the highest diversity of bee species, but weeds and ornamentals and all those other groups collected a high diversity of bee species as well. We didn't do plant abundance, mostly because it was only a couple of us, so that would have been a lot of time. We didn't have it, so we didn't do plant abundance. We didn't assess how much dill was in there at any given time, and so as urbanization increases, community gardens can be valuable resources, and these data can be beneficial for gardeners who want to provide floral resources for wild bees in urban areas. So I think that's all I have. References. It's a lot of references. So if there are any questions, I know that we're taking questions at the end. I think I'm the last one. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. And please tell me, everybody can hear me the whole time and that I didn't just get cut off like halfway through and you guys are too polite to say anything.
No, that was great. We're going to have James jump back in and talk about bee lawns to finish up for us.
Excellent.
Okay, hey everyone, excited to kind of put an end cap on this one. So something that I wanted to touch on is I think part of what was so exciting about the No-Mow May movement is how attainable it felt for everyone that wanted to get involved. It's kind of a very low input from a person's point of view to feel like you're making a change that can be influential from a conservation point of view. So when I talk about bee lawns, I think part of what's really exciting here is this is a very simple change that you could make to your landscape that can have really great impacts for both the conservation of pollinators and the conservation of natural resources. So I'd hope that's something that we can all agree on, even John, who's a turfgrass science guy, I'm a turfgrass science guy myself, I was in the turf lab, is that we probably have too much turfgrass in the United States, where, and from a land coverage point of view, we have about 50,000 square miles of turfgrass, which is good for about 2% of the continental US. When we consider that turfgrass is probably something that we should only have when we want to get a functional use out of it, there's probably a better way we could use a lot of that land mass. To put some big numbers behind it, that's more than 3 times the acreage that we have for irrigated corn. So the solution, we want to take that traditional turfgrass lawn, add in some low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers, and create a nice matrix of flowers and low-input turf grasses that we call a flowering lawn, a bee lawn, or a pollinator lawn. All of those terms are synonymous and all get thrown around there. So what are the goals of a bee lawn? There are 3 main goals that I see. 1, that they're low maintenance, they don't require much upkeep. 2, that they can protect our pollinators, and 3, they can even improve local water quality. Something that I think often gets overlooked is that our traditional turfgrass lawns have pretty shallow root systems, which means they can't infiltrate as much stormwater as, say, a native planting. The species used in the bee lawn mix have much more extensive, complex root systems, which can help them infiltrate more water. So the actual elements of a bee lawn. So I mentioned that I did quite a bit of the bee lawn research. A student before me, his name is Elaine, he did a lot of the work to figure out what plants can actually work in creating a bee lawn. So we'll start first with the turfgrass species. And it's those very same fine fescues that John and I were talking about earlier. where this ended up being a great thing because not only do they allow flowers to coexist in lawns, they're also super low input. So they're great from getting flowers to co-establish, and they're great from reducing our need to mow, water, and fertilize. In terms of the flowers that work great in the bee lawn, there were a few boxes we need to check here. We need them to be able to tolerate typical lawn management practices, AKA, we have to be able to mow you and you have to be able to come back and bloom again. When you think about a mowing event from a plant's point of view, pretty stressful. We're chopping off 1/3 of your body, sometimes a little bit more than that. So it was a little bit of an uphill battle to figure out what flowers would work through that. And we also only wanted to use flowers that provide high quality forage for pollinators. So the first flower that I'll talk about is self-heal. This is one of the native flowers that worked really well. On this flower, we saw both really small and really large pollinators. If you look at the shape of the flower, it's got kind of a constricted whorled bloom and a really long floral neck. So what we expected was bees that with a large body size and long tongues where they could reach down and grab the nectar and the pollen. We actually also saw those really small bees because they were actually able to crawl right into the blooms, grab their nectar, grab their pollen, fly out. It was very, very cute, to use a scientific term. Something that was really exciting about the self-heal is it's not just a nectar resource where most bees are generalists when it comes to nectar. We also saw evidence that bees were collecting pollen from the self-heal, where if you check out this quick little video, you can see that bee running its legs through its hairs, brushing that pollen down into its pollen sacs. Where a lot of the bees that were on this flower, we saw those legs absolutely chock full of pollen, which was really exciting from a pollinator conservation point of view. As Elaine would be able to tell everyone, that is a Bombus bimaculatus. You could see that textbook kind of W outline on the band there of the abdomen. So if there's one factoid that I'd want folks to keep in mind when it comes to the self-heal, it's that more than 95% of the bee visitors we saw in self-heal were native species. So if any of you are those hardcore native plant advocates, I'd want you to remember that this is a great low-growing native flower that you could put in your lawns for bees. You know, something that you can include intentionally rather than just relying on whatever flower species may be naturally occurring in your lawn. A completely different flower from a pollinator's point of view would be creeping thyme. So rather than having these more constricted blooms that are, whorled in a sense, these are really small blooms that are wide open, really great resource for small pollinators. A bee can get in there with their short tongue, get their nectar, get their pollen, etc. So we saw lots of late season bees on this flower, where what's exciting about the creeping thyme is that it blooms really late in the season. This is a flower that blooms well into September. Ben and others have mentioned before that as we get into the later parts of the year, there's not quite as much for pollinators to forage on. So the fact that this is blooming late in the season is really great for those bees we care so much about. Another flower to think about is Dutch white clover. So Dutch white clover will start blooming in May, this time of year where there's a little bit of a dearth of blooms. And what's incredible about the Dutch clover is the sheer diversity of bees that we see on this flower. So Elaine mentioned before that there are more than 500 now bee species in the entire state of Minnesota, where, Elaine and Zach Portman are resident. I call him a cynical teddy bear, where he pretends to have this tough exterior, but he's really a soft, cuddly teddy bear on the inside. They spend so much time identifying different bee species, and they found over 500 now. So on the Dutch white clover, we've seen more than 50 bee species, and about 40% of the bees that we saw on the Dutch white clover were honeybees. So I think it's important to remember that this is a critical source of forage for both the honeybees and the native bees alike, where more than 50 of the bee species we saw on the Dutch clover were native species. So one factoid about the Dutch clover, more than 55 bee species in total, with lots of honeybees present, and also a lot of native bees using this flower. When it comes to the total bee diversity on bee lawns, we saw more than 65 bee species. Speaking of updating figures similar to Aaron, I'll have to change that more than 15% number to more than 10% of all the bees in Minnesota, because Elaine and Zach had the audacity to continue to identify bee species after I graduated. Very selfish in my point of view. A little bit on installation and maintenance. So quickly, when it comes to timing, there are 3 time periods where I think folks can install a bee lawn with a lot of success. One, early in the spring, right after the snow melt, when those soil temperatures are starting to reach the 50-60 degree range. Another one would be in the late summer, similar to that early spring time period. Those soil temperatures will be right in that 60 degree range, perfect for getting plants to start to grow. And also as a dormant seeding late in the fall. So as the name implies, with a dormant seeding, you put the seed down and it lies dormant throughout the winter, and it'll come up the following spring. Really, when it comes to timing, what I'm begging folks to do is please do not plant these in the middle of summer, the middle of July, when it is scorching hot. One of two things will happen: your bee lawn seeding won't take, or you're going to have to water the heck out of it to get it to really go. So a little example of how you can get this done. Step one is to mow that lawn as short as possible. And directly after that mowing event, rake away those clippings. And what you're trying to do through steps 1 and 2 is expose the soil. While you're raking away those clippings, if you could really rough up the soil, it'll give the seed a soft landing to germinate into. Lots of our urban and suburban lawns have really compacted soil, which can make it hard for plants to get going. So that little rough up with a rake can really help. After that, all you got to do is spread the bee lawn mix throughout the area. If you can, water it for the first 2 to 3 weeks, keep it nice and moist. And once you give me those 2 to 3 weeks of hard work, then your maintenance goes way down. These don't need too much watering, don't need too much mowing, don't need too much fertilizer when it comes to long-term sustenance. So that's all I've got for you. I didn't want to keep you too long, but now if folks do have questions, and I see that some have already started to filter in, I believe we can start taking more questions. I'm going to hand things back over to Bridget.
Thank you, everybody. That was amazing. I love this redirection of No-Mow May to Slow-Mow Summer. I think everybody emphasized all kinds of amazing actions that we can take in addition to mowing less. So we do have questions in the chat, and Elaine has been answering them already. So if you have additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat now, or if you want to just turn on your screen or turn off your mute and ask them directly, that is completely fine too. Brooke, do you want to kind of go through the answered questions briefly, so people who are just listening can hear?
Yes, let me scroll back up to the top. So first comment, Elaine says, FYI, a snag is a standing dead tree, in case we didn't catch on to that during Ben's. Someone asked, are there studies of the quality of pollen, such as amino acid content and protein levels? I often wonder if Liatris liquistris, Ben, I'm looking at you, is a nutrition. Pardon?
Ligula stylus.
Ligula stylus is a nutritious plant, or is it just a candy for pollinators? I'll have to practice that one. And Elaine had said, plants do vary a lot in the amount of protein in the pollen and sugar in the nectar. Also, other minerals and micronutrients that can all be important for bees. I believe that the big attraction for pollinators to Liatris is the large amount of nectar they produce. Someone said, this past summer, I had bees coming in and out of a hole in the concrete steps to my house. Any ideas on giving them a better habitat this year? I've heard that quite a few times in our Bee Squad email about bees in the concrete. And Elaine says, bees can be very creative in the holes they choose to nest in. These bees will also use stems. If you are able to leave standing stems in your yard, 8 to 12 inches long, that can help provide nesting spots.
Elaine also put in the chat a PDF that will help people with how to leave those stems and how long to leave those stems as well. And that's also available on our website, along with a lot of other resources. So the University of Minnesota Bee Lab website.
James also responded to, I believe, the pollen question, and says, Rulston and Kane have combined for some really neat publications on the nutritional quality of different flowers for pollinators. I'd recommend checking out some of their work.
In addition to that, the Mississippi State University also is doing a project building a database on pollen and like nutritional value. So it is something that people are interested in and researching. So that would be another website to check out.
Elaine asks, any studies of amount of pollinators are in a normal lawn area? If the normal lawn has clover or other blooming things, there can be a good number of pollinators there.
I feel like Elaine was trying to set me up to point out that my paper was published like a week ago, where we quantified the amount of the number of bees in Minneapolis that were using Dutch white clover and the bee diversity on bee lawns, but also, beyond the work that I did, there's some really great research as well from UMass Amherst and the University of Kentucky, where they looked at similar things, where my research was a little bit novel, and we tried to use a specific lawn mix designed to promote pollinator nutrition and pollinator diversity, where they kind of looked at more just lawns that happen to have flowers growing within them and describing the diversity there. So it's like, here's what you can do if you just simply treat those flowers in your lawn as flowers rather than weeds you have to kill. What does that do for bees? And what I did in my research was, here's what you can do if you want to specifically encourage pollinators in a turf grass lawn. So, a little bit each their own kind of a deal.
And I believe we did share James' new paper on our Facebook page a few days ago. So if anyone wants to check that out.
Yes, it's great. A lot of other Bee Lab folks are on there as well. So the next the questions now, I think we've answered the ones that were already in the chat. So the next one is about Dutch white clover as an invasive, and then hopefully there'll be alternatives. And again, just pointing to James's comment about self-heal and then all of the other natives that Elaine and Ben and others have talked about. So if you are someone who only wants to stick to natives, there's so many options. And if you're someone who maybe just has clover in your lawn and is deciding whether to spray it, don't spray it, because it's a really good food source for bees.
Yeah, I do think it's important to clarify that Dutch clover is not an invasive species. We've had Dutch clover in our lawns for decades now. If it was invasive, boy, would we know by now, where I wouldn't be worried about, one, letting it go in your lawns, or two, planting it yourself. It's good for bees. It doesn't overtake native species. So, for me, I view a flower as beneficial if it, one, doesn't outcompete the natives that you have in your native plantings, and two, if it provides high quality resources for your pollinators. So for me, because it checks both those boxes, I view it as a great plant to use.
But another thing to think about, if you're putting something like Dutch white clover in your lawn's kind of a self-contained area. It's tough to get out of that. Whereas if you're putting something, on my caution list next to a woods or a waterway or something like that, then you got a lot more opportunity to get out of that area. So if you're talking about a lawn, pretty self-contained, it's kind of tough to get out of there, depending on what plant you are. But Dutch white clover, I think it'd be a tough ask to say, all right, jump to that woods over there.
So there's a question about the link for this recording. So once we do the subtitles that we put on our videos, we'll link it back on our Facebook page. So you can check back in to where you found the information about the Zoom, and you'll find the recording when it's available, hopefully in a week or so. Someone asked about where one can find bee lawn mix. So the plants that James described are available as a mix at places like Twin Cities Seed. They're also something that you could look for on your own and create your own mix. James, I don't know if you have more.
You can find it in pretty much any garden center in the Twin Cities these days. Gosh, I don't know what the rules are to promoting garden centers. I feel like I don't want to pick favorites, even if I do have favorites, but it's not going to take too much looking. If you are local in Minnesota, I should think that there are definitely folks here who aren't local. I believe John already posted a link to the University of Minnesota. I see the head, Bob, so I think that we're in the clear here, to the University of Minnesota's Turfgrass Science Lab, where they have a page of all the entities that they know of that sell bee lawn. So if you're looking for the e-commerce option, I'd go that route. If you're local, hey, nothing wrong with supporting a local garden center as far as I'm concerned.
there's a good question, which is, tell us your favorites. And I'm going to assume this person wants to hear the speaker's favorites for bee food and habitat.
Okay, I can go first. I'll give one garden plant and one bee lawn plant. I've always, gosh, I feel like I should choose something that blooms earlier in the season. Okay, I'll go with prairie smoke, even though my actual favorite flower is butterfly weed. Prairie smoke blooms early in the season. It's really pretty, stays nice and low to the ground. I've even used it in boulevard settings. It does quite well there. And for something that you could use in a lawn, I would say self-heal. It's native, tons of native bumblebees on it and other smaller native bees as well. So one for column A, one for column B. Ben, you go. Let's hear some good tree stuff, man.
I was going to go shrub stuff because, again, I got into this to fill my belly, and honeyberries are my favorite. In the right year, you can eat them in May, even the end of May, you're already harvesting from them. And that means you have already had pollinator visitors at the beginning of May or even before that.
That was dramatic.
You got so excited about the honeyberries.
Oops, that's my fault. Ben is using my not great setup in the lab.
There I'm back. Anyways, yeah, honeyberries, super early. We talked about how important it is to have early resources. If you're coming out of winter and you're starving, that's incredibly important to have something already ready there for you to go. Honeyberries, that's my choice for woody, at least. I also agree with self-heal. I love the flowers of them when you're sitting down, just lying in the grass going, this is a wonderful day, and you see a beautiful flower like that. I was trying to think of something different, but self-heal is the best. I love that.
I can jump in this time of year. I'm always just waiting for the willows to start blooming because that's really the kind of the start of the bee season. So right now I'm really excited about willows, and I start to kind of track on where there's good clumps of willows so I can start scoping out bees. Midsummer, I love lead plant, which is can get kind of shrubby. But you find it a lot in remnant prairies. It can take a while to establish, but once it establishes, it's really this beautiful purple, it's kind of more subtle purple flower with sagey leaves and bright orange pollen. Late summer, one of a plant that I'm going to call out just because it has a horrible name, so people might discount it because of the name, sneezeweed. It's actually a really beautiful daisy-like, daisy family kind of plant, super attractive to pollinators, and is great for filling in that gap kind of in the late season.
I'm gonna bounce off of Elaine and jump in or answer a question in the chat about dandelions and if it's a valuable plant to bees. And so, yeah, I, like Elaine, am just waiting for some spring blooms, but I'm waiting more for the dandelions. So dandelions are one of the first flowers that produce nectar for bees. And so, like Ben was talking about, coming out of winter, you're hungry. Those dandelions are really, really great and really, really important for not just honeybees, but also any of those early emerging native bees as well. And it might just be the Wisconsin native in me, but I love to look out into the field and seeing like the green and like gold of the dandelions in the fields.
And just to jump on that a little bit, when I was getting that chart together with the early pollinators that people report to iNaturalist, there were lots of those sightings were on dandelions. So there's definitely a lot of dandelion use. Another just support for Brooke's statement. A lot of bees are using dandelions.
I could jump in too. Dandelion was also one of the most common flower we collected bees off of, or not the most common. We collected a high number of bee species off of dandelion. And I really like the chives. I love the chives, like the globe, like structure of the flower. They're really, really nice looking. They smell nice, and get a lot of bees off of those. They're constant with activity. Russian sage is another really great one. And I really like blazing star, like prairie blazing star. You get a lot of like monarch butterflies on those, or maybe viceroys. Maybe you don't see as many monarchs these days, but a lot of butterflies on those. So those are mine. I like those.
John, I know you've been waiting for your turn to tell us everyone your favorite flower. Let's let it rip.
That's a tough one, honestly. My favorite flower is probably off of a shrub or a tree or something, but pretty big fan of hazelnuts. So I'm gonna kind of misdirect you there, or at least lead you down a different path and go with an obvious grass question or grass response there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to the speakers for all of this information. And thank you to the great questions and all the audience members who have stuck around for quite a long Zoom. So happy spring and happy planting. And please know that the Bee Lab website, as well as a lot of the resources that are in the chat, are available to you throughout the season. Thank you.
Have a good slow-mo summer.
Thanks for inviting me.